Hello, everyone. My name is Tomás Olivier, and I'm going to be presenting on behalf of my co-authors a project that has been led and is being led by Juan Sebastián Uribe Quintero at Syracuse University, and where the co-authors are Ute Brady from Arizona State University, Chris France from Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Saba Siddiqui, and myself from Syracuse University. We have titled this presentation in this project using the institutional grammar to systematically map democratic features in constitutional texts. Now, before I begin, I just want to be mindful and be explicit about the fact that this is a work in progress. We are in the early stages of our project, but we still think that we are in a at a nice spot where we can benefit from your input, comments, and feedback as of where we're going with this project. So, as I said, what we're trying to do here is we're analyzing and mapping systematically democratic features of in constitutional texts. So the first thing that you all might be wondering is why we're looking at constitutions. And there's multiple reasons for this. First of all, the constitutions are the foundational rules of the game for any country and political system. But at the same time, because from a theoretical perspective and a disciplinary perspective, the institutional literature has not dedicated enough attention, we believe, to constitutions as rules in form. In fact, most attention to constitutional texts has come from legal scholars, right? So we think that we, as institutionalists, are in a very good opportunity and position to start contributing to that discussion as well from our perspective. And we think that one of the reasons why institutionalists have not paid sufficient attention to constitutions is because some of the methodologies, mainly the institutional grammar, have not been originally designed to capture constitution design. And this was true up until IG 2.0 came up, which allows us to accommodate the analysis of both constitutive and regulative statement design, especially in constitutions that are uh, where there are plenty of these constitutive institutional statements. What this allows us to do is to enable both a functional and configurational analysis of constitutions. So with that in mind, what we're trying to do in this study is to draw on both legal and institutional theory to engage in a functional analysis of constitutions, and at the same time draw on methodologies of institutional design to engage in a configurational analysis of that design. But what do we mean by a functional analysis of constitutions? In order to answer these questions, we first need to discuss what is that constitutions do? What are the functions of constitutions? Well, as many legal scholars have elaborated, constitutions, what they do is they allocate rights, powers, and responsibilities to a wide variety of actors. So keeping this in mind, the questions that guide this project we're working on are two. One is how are powers allocated and distributed across key institutional actors in the constitutional text? And how do different constitutions assign those powers? As I said earlier, what we're trying to do here is bridge our arguments and concepts from legal theory with concepts and methods from institutional analysis. And one of those arguments and concepts that we're bringing from the legal field is the doctrine of the distinction of powers, which characterizes or which defines democratic systems. And basically, this doctrine of the distinction of powers argues that there are three principles that characterize the distinction of powers. The first principle is the separation of powers, meaning that different actors in a constitutional arrangement receive or are allocated or granted different functions, different sets of authorities. This principle of the separation of powers is immediately closely followed by the principle of the division of powers, which was developed against the concentration of power. We can have multiple functions assigned to actors, but we also need to make sure that those functions are not distributed unevenly to avoid that concentration of power. And last but not least, there is a third principle that has to do with the checks and balances, basically making sure that the different branches can exert control over one another. These three principles uh, configurationally allow for or set the foundations for a uh, distinction of powers in a democratic government and society. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to analyze and to identify empirically how these principles are represented in a constitutional text. And to do so, our goal is to analyze this in five different cases, five different countries that, and these countries are Argentina, Colombia, France, Germany, and the US. And this group of countries, these different countries, allows us to capture for a diversity of written texts. We have relatively short constitutions like the US Constitution, and very, very long constitutions like the Colombian one. We have constitutions that have changed a lot, and we have constitutions that have not. We have constitutions that are relatively new, whereas there's others that have not been modified very much in a long time. In addition to that, these cases allow us to capture for both regimes that are both federal and non-federal countries. So we have a nice mixture of both, and we also have a nice mix of countries that have a strong legislative and a strong executive. So this would allow us to identify how these principles empirically appear in the constitutional text. To capture this, our main tool for analyzing the design of these principles is through the institutional grammar. We are applying IG 2.0, and in order to do so, our main workflow consists of two parts. On one hand, we identify the sections of interest in these constitutions. Our goal for now is to focus only on executive and legislative relations. So we're only looking at attributes and authorities granted to these sets of actors, for which we identify sections of the constitutional text that correspond to these actors. We then extract institutional statements from them and then code them applying IG 2.0. But this is not the only step in our workflow. In fact, we conduct an additional extra step, which would then allow us to capture this configurational nature of the design of these three principles. And to do so, what we do is we create networks of prescribed interactions using this data. And so in our workflow, this is represented with an extra step or an extra series of steps through which, after we code the institutional statements, we categorize animate actors appearing in the attribute and or objects, direct or indirect objects, into to ensure that they all have a consistent name throughout our coding. And then we grant them attributes such as whether they are part of the executive or the legislative. And then we do the same with objects that are with inanimate objects. We categorize them just to make sure, again, that the naming conventions are consistent throughout the document. And with that information, we create networks of prescribed interactions, connecting actors that appear in the attribute with direct and indirect objects as they are mentioned in an institutional statement. Now, as I said, we're in the early stages of our project, but here's how we envision the conceptual application, and here are some of the propositions as well that we're envisioning for our project. As I said earlier, we're interested in looking at these three principles of separations of power, division of power, and checks and balances. And the way we envision capturing empirically these principles is through the creation of relation or identification of relational patterns in a network, right? So this would be an example of a basic building block in the network or a motif in that network where we have an actor that belongs to the legislative and an actor that belongs to the executive, and we have elements over which they have authority. It could be the budget, for instance. Here in this situation, the legislative and the executive both have some degree of authority or power over the budget. And then we have another element over which only the legislative have power. So this is what would be captured by our by this motif or building block. We argue that through this approach, we can identify quantitative, in a quantitative and empirical fashion, things such as the separation of powers, which is which of these elements uh, are are assigned to these actors. We look at the division of power, meaning if there is a balance or an unbalanced distribution of elements across these two sets of actors. In this case, for instance, we see that the legislative has authority over two elements, whereas the executive has it only over one. And then we can see also the checks and balances, which occur mainly in situations where we have an element that is affected by both actors at the same time, which will give us a sort of a sense of one actor controlling or limiting what the other actor can do in a way. So with that in mind, we argue that, first of all, it is possible to empirically observe features of these three principles. And then with that information, our goal is to test a series of propositions or competing propositions about how these design features would show up in federal versus non-federal countries. Here, for instance, we have two competing propositions about the array of powers that are attributed to legislative and executive powers in to legislative and executive actors in federal versus non-federal constitution. In a federal constitution, because there's another layer of subnational governments that have authority and autonomy and some degree of autonomy. We argue that that federal constitution it's possible that they will grant an more extensive array of powers to the legislative and an executive than in the non-federal constitution. The competing proposition to that one says that in a non-federal constitution, uh, the authorities that in a federal system are granted to a subnational government, all of those go back to or are granted to the national level government. Therefore, we should expect the executive and legislative to have a more extensive array of powers than in a federal constitution. But we also develop a series of propositions about how this would look like in regimes that have a strong executive versus regimes that have a strong legislative. For instance, another set of propositions that we developed argued that in strong executives, there's going to be, because the executive is the powerful branch there will be more array of unique powers assigned to the executive, whereas in strong legislatives, there would be a more unique array of powers assigned to the legislative. And then the subsequent set of propositions argues that in a strong executive, because the executive should have a higher array of unique powers, the powers that are attributed to the legislative would be focused so mainly around legislative oversight. Whereas in a strong legislative, the converse would occur. So for instance, in a situation like the graph that we would have here, we could treat this as a situation of a strong legislative, right? Because the legislative has a broader array of unique powers assigned to it than the executive. In this case, the legislative has two sets of authority over two elements, where the executive has authority over ones. So that would be our second proposition, the content of our second proposition here. The additional layer of propositions that we developed argue that in a strong legislative, in addition to the legislative having more unique powers, the powers that are assigned to the executive have to do mainly with oversight or authority over elements over which the legislative also has authority. So this is more or less where we're at the moment. We're trying to leverage the elements and tools of IG 2.0 to see if it's possible to empirically observe uh, principles of divisions of power, separations of power, and checks and balances on at the Constitution uh, level of text. As part of our next steps, well, first of all, we need to acknowledge that this is, of course, is will not capture the entirety of all of the functions that are attributed to executive and legislative powers in a given country. And also, we recognize that this is just a coarse approach for measuring legal concepts. But nevertheless, we think that is an important step forward to empirically observing these at the level of text. As part of our next steps, what we're trying to do is finishing collecting our data, encoding the accept of the constitutions, and generating the networks of prescribed interactions for each of these 5 constitutions. I want to thank you all for your time. I'm going to leave it at that.